Welcome back to the Network Nations mini-series on the Green Pill podcast. I'm Felix Beer. I will be your host for this episode. And in this episode, we want to move from theory to practice and look at how network nations can actually begin to take shape in the real world. That means we will focus on something we often call proto-network nations. So very early stage experiments where communities start to tinker with some core elements of the network nations framework, such as translocal membership, decentralized governance, and shared resource management, all across geographic boundaries and facilitated by digital networks. Around the globe, we see many of these proto-network nations that are beginning to take shape. And some of the examples we have already discussed in previous episodes. We talked to community stewards of communities such as Burning Man, Region DAO, and Edge City. And today we want to look at yet another very interesting case, another interesting early stage community experiment, which is SeeDAO. And SeeDAO was founded in 2021 and describes itself as a digital polis for global nomads. It brings together builders, creators, and thinkers, many of whom are part of the global Web3 community, into a self-governing ecosystem that spans both physical and digital spaces. Today, the community stretches across more than 25 countries, and it includes more than 1,000 contributors. But what's interesting about SeeDAO is that it's not just merely a decentralized autonomous organization, which is purposed for, coordination and investment, but it really has this ambition to become something like a community of kinship. And at its core, it is also stated on their website. So the website says basically SeeDAO aims and aspires to become a community to nurture a sense of a good life together through practices of like collective action, mutual support, and shared learning, and essentially also through an ambition to cultivate a strong sense of common belonging. So beyond all the governance tooling, which is often built in DAOs, such as on-chain identity and reputation systems and so on, there are a lot of cultural practices and social organizations that SeeDAO tries to build on top. So SeeDAO has a town hall where members are often meeting in digital or sometimes even in physical spaces to discuss matters, to vote on things, to get a sense of where they want to move this collective community project towards. And they have also gatherings in physical spaces. So they have local nodes and they have a set of cultural practices which they are trying to cultivate. So the interesting thing is that SeeDAO brings together the technical dimension of DAOs with like the aspiration of becoming a nation. And in this sense, it's like a very interesting case to look at when we talk about proto-network nations. It has many familiar features that we try to describe with our theory. It is a translocal community, as I said. So there are people meeting in digital, but also in physical spaces. It has a strong sense of kinship, and there are a lot of emerging forms of collective governance. So the question we want to explore is whether SeeDAO can be understood as a proto-network nation and what its experience can teach us about building networked forms of community self-governance from the bottom up. To explore these questions, we are very excited to be joined today by Helena Rong. Helena Rong is an assistant professor for interactive media and business at the York University in Shanghai, where she leads a lab on protocol innovation. Helena is also a close friend and collaborator of the Network Nations community. So she's very familiar with a lot of the concepts we're trying to discuss and explore in this context. But at the same time, she has also conducted research, in-depth research on the SeeDAO community itself. So she spoke to a lot of the members and explored basically how forms of digital governance, trust building, and community practice are taking shape within their framework. So she's basically perfectly positioned to bring together network nation theory with the practical realities of SeeDAO. So this will be an exciting episode. I'm very much looking forward to it. Enjoy the ride. Hi, Helena. Super excited to have you on the episode to discuss SeeDAO as a potential case study for network nations.
Yeah, super happy to be here.
You are one of the few people probably on this planet right now who can discuss this interesting intersection between the emerging community project of SeeDAO, since you've spent some time with them and even worked, I think, with them. And you are also a close collaborator of our Network Nations community, so you're familiar with our theory. So I hope you can help us build a bridge between SeeDAO as a case study and network nations as like a theoretical framework today. Yeah, maybe you want to kick us off actually by telling us a little bit about SeeDAO, what this community is about, and what your relationship and maybe also past engagement with this community is.
Yeah, so my relationship with this group, I guess, has been, I've been studying the group as an example of a decentralized Chinese community. And because I've been, looking at DAOs more for Western context in the past. So I was really curious to see, like whether different cultural and kind of, societal norms actually brew different kinds of governance. And so when I discovered SeeDAO, which is one of the largest kind of Chinese-speaking DAO community, I was really intrigued because I wanted to know, their philosophies, how they are, dealing with governance and kind of compare my understanding of what I learned about DAOs in the past with, like a different context. So I've been kind of, like looking at this group for the past, I would say over half a year. And so working closely with my kind of collaborator, Professor Sun Zhe, who's also based in Shanghai on kind of, analyzing this from a sociological perspective. And so, producing kind of academic papers. And I think like being part of Network Nations discussion really helped us kind of, formulate a lot of our ideas. And so CDAO is actually this DAO that was established back in 2022, and we know that that's a period where like DAOs were like very popular. It was very trendy. A lot of different kind of groups and from all over the world were experimenting with it. And so it was one of the most kind of prominent, it became one of the most prominent kind of Chinese speaking DAOs, despite the fact that they actually welcome everybody. But I think, it was, I think in its inception, kind of drawing mostly like Chinese people from around the world. So that's where we, kind of see it as a diasporic community. But what was interesting is the background of SeeDAO is it at first was initially a company. Like the two founders who, started the DAO, they were actually at first working on a Web3 like NFT company. Which I think at the end they realized, okay, this company structure, this hierarchical structure wasn't for me, like wasn't for them. So they wanted to kind of, they were also paying attention to what was going on, kind of these new organizational innovations. And then so wanted to turn their kind of company into like more of a community. And that's where it kind of, had this transition. So which I thought, when I found out about this, it's a very interesting kind of background, right? Because I think it had some of its DNA and kind of, innovation and kind of, like thinking about like, organization, governance, and structure. And there was a very intentional kind of, switch from what was seen as these traditional kind of structures of how people organize themselves to do things to, these more decentralized versions, which focus more on the community building aspect.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting. So they started out as kind of a small community project within the Web3 scene, but they have definitely the aspiration, as far as I can tell from your stories, but also from their website, to grow into something much larger. Because on the website, it also mentions that they want to become actually a digital polis, so like a city state for global nomads, not only for the Web3 community, but also, as you said, the Chinese diaspora at large. So could you maybe tell us a little bit about this this community they're trying to speak to? You call it a diasporic community. I don't think they explicitly said it on the website, but it attracts mainly people with a link to the Chinese culture, I would say. So what's the connection there?
Yeah, I think that has to do with kind of like, their own, founders' own background. They were based in China, but they also, like were very aware of what was going on, like, in the Western context of what was happening to DAOs. But I think in my interviews with them, actually, I found out that, at first they wanted to kind of integrate with the existing kind of, like Western DAOs. So I think they reached out to, groups like Bankless DAO and a few others trying to learn, what others have been doing. But I think maybe because of language, because of culture, and because of, like the physical location, it was, like it was kind of difficult for them to integrate into kind of, these Western DAOs. So they were kind of like, okay, why don't we build our own DAOs and to, serve the community who, in China, there was also a lot of people who were interested in this. So I think, yeah, you're right about their, website featuring kind of their vision, which is building a digital colis for like 1 million people or something. And I think that kind of there's another background that is quite important here is because when it was first being created, it was actually during the period of COVID. Right. So we know that it's a period where there's a lot of uncertainty, a
Hmm.
lot of kind of shift to like work from home, hybrid, work. And so people's lives were, facing a lot of changes. And it was also a period where, like I think people might have felt isolated if they weren't able to, if their physical mobility was reduced because of regulatory changes, which varied from place to place. But we also know that in China, there was a period where it was much more difficult to kind of, move around, right? So I think so all of these things sort of coincided to a moment where they first were kind of interested in what was going on kind of with these organizational innovation, but then they realized it was an opportunity to also kind of build these primarily online based community to connect people who maybe needed that during a special time. Yeah.
Right, and it is a platform to connect beyond just like the usual Web3 stuff, which is often focused on like investment and like I don't know, like different kind of tech stuff. But they also have like they seem to focus really on these kind of core values, right, which they want to
Yeah.
nurture and cultivate together. And there is this interesting notion on their website that they want to build like a decentralized community, right, with Web3 infrastructure, but focused on the Chinese diaspora, as we said, with the purpose of pursuing a good life. And that's almost like very philosophical, right? Almost Aristotelian in a way. So there is this notion of like how to constitute, a virtuous good life together. And I wonder if you can plug us a bit more, give us a bit more info on what they actually think is a good life and what constitutes that.
Yeah. So what is extremely interesting about this group, and in particular, like the philosophy that they adopted as part of their vision, which also drew me in at the first place, is they're kind of they were drawing inspiration from Daoist philosophy,
Mm.
right? So actually, but Daoist philosophy is not something that's entirely foreign within Web3, because actually in the paper that Vitalik Glenwell and Pooja O'Haver has written, The Decentralized Society, Searching for Web3 Soul, when they first introduced the notion of, soul-bound token, they actually quoted chapter 62 of Lao Tzu, which says that the heart and home of the 10,000 things, good souls treasure it and lost souls find shelter in it. It's kind of like, depicting this notion of a kind of a free wandering world where all kinds of beings are accepted in this very plural and a way, right? And that's a kind of delineating a very different notion of liberty and freedom that is very different from kind of the kind of liberal notion of freedom that we know in the Western context. And like SeeDAO in particular has also drawn to these ideas, and in their manifesto slash white paper, and I think also like featured on our websites, the three keywords that encapsulate what they think a good life is are co-presence, emergence, and wandering. So wandering in Chinese translating to xiaoyao is kind of, the Daoist philosophy of what freedom is. So I think these three words kind of, like show in different ways of what, the group was aspiring to be at a kind of visionary level. So 共在 or co-presence is kind of talking about the who of what is part of a good life, which is basically, the good life begins with collective living, with being with others, right? Because 共在 means kind of co-presence, you're co-present with someone else. And so this might include, like friendship, mutual recognition, and building some sort of a commons, right? And that's something that, like in Web3, I think some people are really kind of interested in drawing inspirations from like Eleanor Ostrom, and the kind of the literature on commons is something that we're all very familiar with. And then the second keyword is 涌现, or translating to English, it's emergence. And this is the how, right? So how does co-presence emerge? How does a good life kind of emerge from like being together? So I think this is kind of what they think governance should function as. So it's kind of like governance should enable emergence rather than impose control. And I think this is what differs. SeeDAO differs from maybe some of its Western counterparts, because I think when we talk about like like governance mechanism design, it's always kind of it's this trend of thinking of how to optimize governance, how to, optimize everything we can think of kind of, preemptively such that we can encode these laws as code and have them, like built into smart contracts and basically have this kind of perfect, automated process in which decisions can be made. But I think, the notion of emergence introduces something quite different. And also in Daoist philosophy, there's a word for it. It's called wu wei, or non-action, right? So it's kind of like, governance emerges from this notion of non-governance as a form of governance, which is, it's not about coercive coordination, but it's actually about, leaving enough kind of gray space for things to kind of, jiggle around if, they don't necessarily work. And I think there's examples of SeeDAO's governance, which, following this sort of philosophy in their design of their governance protocols, which we can talk about later, which we see, like during moments of uncertainty, it actually emerges as something that provides some kind of resilient infrastructure. And then finally, the third word, the third keyword, which is xiaoyao, or wondering. This is kind of the why of their doing this, right? Like, why do you have to have a co-presence of people who share the values, and they need to kind of emerge the way they govern themselves? And this is kind of, at the pinnacle of what they, see what a good life is particularly the notion of a form of freedom that is very different from, the Western freedom from constraints, but rather it's freedom through relation, right? So it's cultivating kind of ease and balance while living inside constraint. And it's about, not necessarily pursuing kind of individualistic pursuit of freedom, but actually just allowing kind of differences to exist and, to be, right? And so, and I think this is, like in the context of, the Chinese context where we know, the kind of culture is very different. I think this is something that people find a form of kind of, solidarity and kind of connection too, which is a very much kind of culturally embedded element. So I think, to encapsulate what, like good life means in SeeDAO, it's kind of like you pursue this notion of wandering as a type of freedom, drawing out what I was kind of describing from even Lao Tzu's original writing, through allowing for, governance and rules and kind of these ways of interacting as a collective to emerge. And then you are sharing that with the collective through, this notion of co-presence, whether it's online or offline.
Mm. Yeah, I think it's beautiful. I mean, they have a very deep philosophical and cultural understanding of the community they want to build. And I think that is in many ways like a stark contrast actually to a lot of the Web3 projects, which often have sophisticated tooling and so on. But I would say at least often not a very thorough or deep understanding of the cultural elements of the communities they want to nurture. But despite of this, I think the key question then becomes though how to actually bring these kind of values alive, how to build a community around this. You mentioned building as one of the activities that can help to instantiate a community. That's actually something which was also echoed in another episode we recorded with Timo Coster and John Hillis, who are both community builders, Absidy and Kevin. And they also said like it's great to build like tooling and cultural and philosophical concept of a community, but in the end of the day, you need a practice, a day-to-day practice which brings people together and allows things to naturally evolve. So maybe before we go into the entire theoretical part around network nations, maybe you can give us a sense of like what is the kit that keeps this community together and helps it thrive at the moment? Like what are people doing in the day-to-day practice in SeeDAO?
Yeah, I can definitely kind of try to describe it. Thankfully, I have my notes with me. They have a pretty elaborate governance structure. There's a different kinds of tokens that they use. I think to this day, like I still like, try to identify, oh, this token is used for this. And so they do have so they have two kind of main documents which hold the group together. One is kind of the white paper, which is kind of outlining, the visionary kind of ideals, why they exist, what they're striving for, which is more qualitative, right? And then on the other hand, it's about like how do we actually encode these into kind of governance rules through what they call a meta protocol. So with these two
Mhm.
documents, it's kind of almost like a yin yang like dance, right? Like one is, trying to, like take them to the state of, wondering. And then one is like, okay, we're still on the ground. Like, how do we, manage these people who are, joining the community? So basically, with this kind of meta protocol, it's basically their kind of document for self-organization. And so membership kind of begins with the creation of an on-chain wallet and also a small transaction to activate participation. So this is kind of like, the onboarding experience I think a lot of people who first come in contact with Web3 would experience. And then so for them, not these newcomers, they can earn non-transferable contribution points. I think it's called SCR for the group. And so this is kind of through like community activities, which maybe then converted into like a citizen badge or their seed NFT, which is kind of granting people with voting rights in their they have this kind of node consensus assembly, what they call like a basically kind of a arena for people to like make proposals and to vote. Right. So it's kind of like you have to contribute enough in order to like kind of upgrade your badge into like a
Mhm.
voting or at least, person with right to make proposals. So it's not like, I think with some other DAOs, sometimes, people can just join, they can buy an NFT online, and then without, ever kind of having contributed to existing initiatives, people can just make proposals. That's what I have seen other DAOs. But for SeeDAO, it's kind of like you need to sediment yourself into this community before having the right to do so. And then apart from the seed NFT, they also have three additional kind of token instruments, which can help establish their entire socioeconomic infrastructure. One is they have this kind of non-transferable reputation system called the Wang token, which is kind of something that records the historical contributions and kind of determines the governance weights, right? So we know that, for some DAOs, the one token, one vote, generates a lot of problems with like, SIBO attacks or kind of the whale problem, right? So I think like, SeeDAO, having studied many other DAO governance models, we're trying to kind of like reduce that risk by introducing kind of this, governance weighted token based on kind of a reputation system, which also I think like refreshes like every 3 months or something. So it's not something that you can accumulate. It's kind of like it's kind of introducing this way of encouraging people to constantly stay engaged in order to even have the governance right to do certain things. And then they also have, their own soulbound tokens, which represent, their member skills, works, social identity. So it's kind of like, what distinguishes one person from the other.
Right.
And so this is kind of, something that's recorded and anchored within the SeeDAO naming service. So this is, basically each person would have their unifying credential under a unique on-chain identity. And I think this is also something quite intriguing because I think this is a moment where we see blockchain turning from a financial ledger to a
Mhm.
social ledger. And
Right.
like, I think this concept might be really abstract, but I was in one of their in-person events actually right after our Network Nations workshop last summer, where SeeDAO basically was having this digital nomad week. They were organizing this 200 person event in a small village in Fujian province in China. And then one night, they had this kind of group gathering with all those OG CDAO members, kind of on-chain identity, their SNS, and kind of a list of their contributions displayed on screen, recognizing each person's endeavors. And I think that moment really, became really emotional for a lot of people because I think, sometimes each person is made unique because of our unique kind of memories, but I don't think there's necessarily this kind of memory device which tracks these special moments. And I think that's when like, tokens, not just financial tokens, but the real power of NFTs I see is that, it can actually turn something that's intangible, memorable, meaningful into something that we can see. And it might not be something that, in the moment we recognize as being valuable, but many years later, right? Like these members, when they see a list of things that they have done for the community, that's when they feel like, that there's a strong resonance. And I think that, that's the power of the social ledger kind of recording these memories and having it an infrastructure for them to be stored and exist without the fear of erasure. And so I thought that was, something really beautiful about the way that they use tokens for managing this kind of social infrastructure for the group. And another token, which is they originally wanted to design also their own economic currency, which is the
Mm.
seed token. So this was kind of like, to sustain their common-based production. But in practice, I think this never took off. And actually, they just passed a proposal recently to, basically entirely shut down this idea and just keep SeeDAO like a, more of a social community without, any financial motives. Because I think, with Goodhart's law, right? Like
Really?
once you turn, financial incentives or you introduce that as part of the group, that kind of, turns some people's contribution incentives into something different. So I think that's something that they're, intentionally moving away from. And that's a decision that has, finally been made after the group has existed for more than 2 years. So yeah.
Yeah, it's super interesting. So I think so we have two elements now here. On the one hand side, there is like this philosophical and cultural aspiration to become more than just merely like an online community, but really cultivate this community of kinship around these set of like Daoist values, which are embedded in Chinese culture. And as far as I understand, there is like a lot of communities around the world which they are trying to bring together into this larger community platform and weave this kind of emergent identity from this. And then on the other end, you have this very sophisticated, it sounds like it at least, governance structure with various tokens which are enabling this community to, you know, to coordinate together, to collaborate, and yeah, you create a collective value, I would say. So I think for us it's really interesting to look at this as like a case study for network nations because it has a lot of the elements I think that we would assign to a proto network nation at least. It has this kind of political identity. It has sophisticated governance structures. So I wondered, like, from your perspective, do you feel like there is an emergent sense in the SeeDAO amongst the SeeDAO people that there is some sort of like a form of nationhood, maybe? So is there a strong sense of like shared kinship, solidarity with the people in this network, where people actually align around these kind of values and they're really trying to construct something with a shared future? Where they have some sort of like a political project, you could say.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting because I think, even during our discussion, Network Nation as a name, like nation carries a lot of, connotations about, nationhood and kind of, kinship, blood, and, like you said, even political identity. And I think, so for SeeDAO, if we were to match its characteristics, its qualities, one to one with some of the qualities that we see with Network Nation, I think some of them really resonate, while others may be more debatable. Like, for instance, I think the notion of building a community where you have a bunch of people where, there might not be necessarily, related by blood, but they share, similar values and, this kind of mutual bonds and sense of kinship of, like basically a good life they wish they aspire to be part of. I think that definitely, checks, right? Like, as I mentioned before, like SeeDAO is, I think the commons that they're governing is the community itself, right? They're not building a software. I mean, they are building software and such, these tools to help, the community to function. But I think the primary kind of, purpose of the group existence is to sustain that community itself, right? It doesn't. It simply just wants to exist. But I think in terms of so that's, I think, shared identity, the names, the badges, the reputation. All of this is creating a sense of belonging across borders, and I think that works also nicely with the idea of translocality, right? Because I think Network Nation, as we've mentioned, how it differs from Network State is it's refraining from a claim of kind of territorial ownership, right? So it's kind of like the emphasis more on the values rather than claiming land per se. And I think that's exactly, like what, SeeDAO is also doing, right? It's not, really going around having people move there and buy land, etc. And so it, at least before, existed primarily as a online community.
But maybe I just to dive a bit deeper into this notion of translocality, just to make it a bit more clear. So what we understand as translocality is basically this idea that network nations are probably communities which are existing in specific localities around the world. So there are
But
people with a Chinese kind of identity who kind of associate with SeeDAO, but they live in scattered around the world. And they meet either in online places or converge in gatherings or something in physical localities together at some points in time. And I think and this creates this kind of online-offline hybrid, which is kind of like spanning the globe, or at least large parts of the world, and brings them together into this shared governance structure and political framework. But I think, and the actually interesting thing is just to mention this here. I remember that SeeDAO was actually trying to not only exist in online spaces, so to provide like a platform, but to intentionally bring people together for gatherings similar to pop-up cities in order to kind of really build the communities in the real world as well, in a tangible way.
yeah, and I think that like kind of physical presence is part of the co-presence, right? I think it's a
Right.
more powerful one than the purely online one. And I think the group is, with the event that they hosted last summer, which is this digital nomad week, actually, which was collaboration with local kind of or like nonprofit organizations, NGOs, and kind of local groups, universities, trying to explore the intersection of kind of digital nomadism and this idea of rural revitalization, which I think in the context of China is super interesting. And so, yeah, I think like this kind of offline, online kind of, duality definitely exists to both mutually reinforce the group. Because I think, most of these members are scattered across China, across the world. And, like sometimes maybe, there's not really I think in bigger cities, you might have, more, group members who can meet offline. But, there's also others who are like kind of scattered in, maybe places where there's no other CDAO members. So I think their locality nature is like, one is they might have, multiple members who are in the same city. They can, maybe sometimes organize, their own gatherings. But they also make these intentional endeavors, which is more public city-like, which is, having these very sort of planned events where people actually block out the date in their calendars and they would fly over, for example, to this Pingnan village that I was also fortunate enough to have attended last summer. So there's a kind of a mix of these things, but I definitely see that like in-person engagement is super important for community building because you can have so many Zoom meetings, but having offline engagement is just different. And I think that's also what I think the trend that we see with edge cities, pop-up cities, right? Like people kind of, actually intentionally gathering offline to discuss ideas, to kind of, share moments together. So I think that's also one thing that SeeDAO's operations, the way they kind of, have this group also resonates with ideas that we've talked about in Network Nations.
And I think in this sense, it is like an interesting upgrade to the more, I don't know, traditional or widespread notion of what DAOs can be and are usually a purpose for, because usually DAOs are kind of like almost instrumental kind of like governance architectures. You have a platform and you have people engaging with it, and usually they're just engaging with a DAO in order to refine its toolings or have like a very narrow kind of, like purpose of like, fintech or something. But like in this case, it feels much more like you have actually an existing global community around this like Chinese diasporic identity. And now they're building scaffolding and coordination tooling with their DAO platform to support this existing real world community to coordinate in better ways. And I think that's qualitatively speaking, something very different. It's like having a DAO, which is kind of like an end in itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I think like definitely there's this kind of tension between instrumental rationality versus value rationality, right? Like one is like how we do it, and then that's about like, designing the governance systems and optimizing the way, organizations function to usually strive for more efficiency. And I think with the speed of Web3, like sometimes that, accelerates to something that's very rapid. And then on the other hand is value rationality, right? It's like, why do we do this at the first place? Apart from just, like playing with these tools, which are super cool and new. And I think that's, kind of in resonance with what I was discussing earlier with these two documents, which is key to SeeDAO, right? One is white paper, which is outlining its values, and one is the meta protocol, which is, having this very elaborate kind of design of, different kind of tokens in order to achieve that. So I think like, one is definitely serving the other. But I think the value rationality here is even more important if you want to build something that's more long term, that's more kind of socially sustainable. Yeah.
And before, I think so we started this part of the conversation by kind of outlining, okay, we have elements of the network nations theory that map quite neatly on SeeDAO, and I think we discussed like some core elements now. And on the other end, we have maybe some elements that are maybe less aligned.
Yeah.
And before we, I think, so we had some discussions, of course, leading up to this interview, and we discussed, for instance, the notion of sovereignty, which is key to our understanding of network nations. So in our understanding for, like a political entity, like a network nation to operate with as little interference by external actors as possible, we need a sovereign infrastructure and like some sort of like tooling which allows you to act with a certain degree of autonomy as at least in specific domains that are relevant to you. And that might be a little bit in tension, I think, with how SeeDAO sees itself, as far as I understand. And there's maybe a little bit of interesting background also to unpack with the relation between SeeDAO as like a global community and also the Chinese state, which is obviously kind of like at least culturally interwoven with this project.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, and yeah, the word sovereignty is definitely, something that's more kind of tricky, right, in the context of China. And I think, in the context of China, we don't see too much of collective action, because so I think like, to see SeeDAO as potentially become a political identity, I don't really see that happening. And I think, they would also disagree that that is
Agree.
something that they're, moving toward or striving to be. But I think on the other hand, what is, like possible and what we do see as something that's prevalent is social action, right? So in China, you actually have a lot of kind of these, like bottom up initiatives where, community driven kind of governance kind of innovations that's happening to essentially, like solve for a lot of, like social collective problems from the bottom up. And so I would say, maybe categorize SeeDAO as more of a social and even a spiritual identity, because they're, striving for these Daoist kind of ideals. But I don't really see that them being like a political identity per se. And I think in terms of, like building this infrastructure which allows for self-organization, I think for CDAO the goal isn't necessarily to escape from the existing, to
Mhm.
exit their existing kind of state or nation. It's rather kind of building this kind of parallel world which you can, then have the opportunity to connect with others and kind of who share the same values. So it's, in a way, I think it's exit without exiting, right? There's still a lot of touch points. Like people's lives are still very much entangled within their existing systems. And the goal, I think, for most people, or at least all the members I've talked to, I don't think there is a kind of intentional, placing the existing like nation state as the opposition. That's something they need to run away from. But it's kind of like building this parallel infrastructure which allows them to have more, to like basically have an expanded notion of how life could be possible, especially if we were talking about COVID and people wanting to find communities. I think those were real needs, but I don't think it was like trying to necessarily escape or exit from where they were. So I think that's also why with this kind of digital nomad meets
Mm.
rural revitalization is particularly interesting to me as a researcher, because then we see, these very interesting touch points where these two worlds actually collide and interface. And there is a potentiality for common ground in which, I think at the end of the day, like, people want to live a good life and that's their primary value, and why they do certain things, and not necessarily to build something new for the sake of it. So
Yeah.
I think that would be what I
And I think
see.
that's not in opposition to how we understand what network nations could be, because in the first instance, network nations try to fulfill the needs and aspirations of a specific community. And that does not have to mean that they are in opposition to territorial states, nation states. I think that's precisely not necessarily the case, because in contrast to the network state, right, the project of Balaji and his peers, network nations are not trying to claim territory. So they're not trying to buy land and, like basically compete on the level of the nation state around territorial jurisdictions and the control over them. But basically they can build scaffolding, which can be complementary and layered on top of the existing international order, and fill in where maybe our existing public institutions sometimes fail or have difficulties to address the specific needs, expectations, and so on of underrepresented communities. And in
Yeah.
this way, it can be I think that's actually also an interesting case with SeeDAO. There can be this interesting collaboration between, potentially in the future, between network nations and nation states, because they might be able to plug in where to mutually support each other. Because in the end of the day, like the members, of course, of network nations also are always have multiple identities and
Yeah.
affiliations, because they are, of course, located in specific actually existing nation states. They are part of, like the essential services, healthcare system, all of these kind of things, which are hard infrastructures that probably network nations cannot provide in the foreseeable future. So most network nations have like a quite narrow, I guess, like value proposition, and try to plug in where there's a concrete need of specific communities to build additional like institutional frameworks, if that makes any sense. Like, could you maybe flesh also, let's maybe hypothesize a little bit, but like, where do you see this potential collaboration between the existing structures in the Chinese state and SeeDAO to play out? Like, where can SeeDAO plug in maybe to fulfill specific needs here?
Yeah, I can maybe speak a little bit more about kind of this emergence of kind of the trend of digital nomadism in China and across the world, right? And what China is trying to do with rural revitalization, which has been the question, how to deal with the countryside, which has been like decades of endeavor. And so I think in the context of China, like there's a lot of kind of these rural areas which I think the state has trying to, introduce new infrastructure, promoting people from, maybe moving from the urban areas to, reoccupy these spaces so that they would also, breathe new life as if, like what we see with urban regeneration in cities. And so over the last 10 years, there has been a lot of resources dedicating to, building new roads, upgrading, the, kind of infrastructure for basically people to live, right? And sanitization, etc. And then you also saw a lot of people who moved to these areas. But I think over the last couple of years, what the state has realized is reaching kind of this kind of problematic kind of state where you have people moving into these from the urbanized kind of moving into these new villages, and then they're like opening their own Airbnbs. They're kind of establishing new communities. But then these areas, they attract like primarily tourists during tourist peak seasons, right? So like during the summer or like during holiday season, and then for the rest of the year it's just empty. So how do you actually really attract people to these areas? And then they'll notice that there's digital nomads like SeeDAO, like a lot of not just Web3 communities, but I think like post COVID, this trend of people having greater mobility. And so I think this experiment that SeeDAO is somewhat part of, that we
Yeah.
see in Fujian province, is like seeing, okay, could we actually introduce this social kind of
Yeah.
capital, which is enabled by this kind of digital capital or digital flow of
Mhm.
information, which then eventually would introduce, economic financial capital circulation. So they're trying to see whether, you can introduce kind of these kind of social holidays, which are, like they don't necessarily have to be Chinese New Year. They don't necessarily have to be, Qingming Festival or something. But actually each group, because, if I have a DAO or, we have a network nation, you can have your own holidays and festivals and kind of these activities, which can, like be programmed throughout the year. And then so I think they're seeing this trend as something that potentially can fill the void of, the non kind of holiday peak seasons. And so I think SeeDAO is, one of the first, groups that's participating in this. And I think that's actually something, quite beautiful to see the old villagers and these kind of new villagers and now like SeeDAO, their members as, these new incomers, which are introducing fresh kind of circulation of information, which actually activates these areas. And then these people from all three worlds can, somehow coexist. And then that also kind of resonates with their idea at the first place, which is co-presence, right? So this co-presence
Yeah.
actually, this boundary can expand to, a much larger surface to serve more people who, like I think at the end of the day are pursuing some kind of a good life, right? So I see that as a really kind of interesting moment and an example of where, like a proto network nation could kind of work very closely actually with existing components of the nation, that they're actually part of. And so I'm really looking forward to see where this goes because actually, after this event, which was supposed to be kind of, one time temporary pop-up city, one of the founders of SeeDAO, he actually moved there. And I think they're establishing some of a more semi-permanent maybe station, right, to kind of integrate these, digital nomad culture. And so I think this is all kind of, something that's happening in real time and evolving and something that definitely worth paying attention to.
Yeah. As we said, I think so. And this is a very different project again as the network state is proposing, because it's not about like acquiring land and building gated communities, but it's really about like integrating in local communities, trying where to see where you can build meaningful synergies and collaborations. And basically adding an additional layer on top of the territorial jurisdictions which are hosting these kind of community gatherings. And I think like Edge City, for instance, is also like a great example of this. And I think this is also like vaguely how they are thinking about how to move their experiment forward, is to understand how they can actually bring specific value from like a pool of global talent to specific places in order to work on local challenges, right? Like now you talked, for instance, about the revitalization of like maybe economically disadvantaged or rural areas in China. And there's also a set of different challenges, I think, that could be addressed through this kind of prism going forward. And I think it exactly how you described it, it creates this interesting new kind of approach where you're trying to solve local problems with local communities, but a pool of international talent. But yeah, so what are certain directions, because you just mentioned it yourself, like how do you see this experiment of SeeDAO evolve, and what are steps they, from your perspective at least, would have to take in order to become more fully a network nation going forward?
Yeah, I think what is interesting is, even in the context I was describing, like this kind of rural revitalization, it cannot just rely on a single group like SeeDAO, right? It actually requires more a plural kind of network of different organizations who each have their own kind of, self-governing rules and, token structures or, like governance structures, but somehow are able to, like in a interoperable way to work with each other. And I think that's also something that we discussed, in the Network Nations workshop is, right, like you have these, these smaller groups or these, sub communities or, independent communities, which then belong to like some of a meta, larger kind of network of communities, which can, share some resources or, like work with each other. And so I think like, for CDAO to kind of proceed forward, I think it's also about, okay, how do you maybe potentially work with other groups that might be coming in, either, belonging to within the Web3 ecosystem or not? Like, how do you, actually what resources do you share? What kind of common protocols do you share? How do these things get established? And I think that's also something that we were kind of discussing about back in Stockholm, which is we have so many different types of intentional communities, and each community has their own flavor, character, people. That some of them might overlap, others might have very small, overlapping Venn diagrams, right? But somehow, they have something common which is kind of this fluid nature and these network communities with physical touch points. I think like having a more kind of meta governance of these communities, I think would be really interesting, and I kind of look forward to seeing how SeeDAO evolve, because definitely the Peanut Village, it already contains people of different communities, right? And I think there will be more people coming to occupy, the spaces and infrastructures. So I'm definitely going to keep a close eye tracking, how they kind of navigate these changes and kind of, different people that they will encounter.
Yeah, exciting. Yeah, maybe because you also mentioned our workshop. So, Helena, you were one of the people who was part in last year's workshop on network nations in Stockholm. We brought together some community builders, some theorists, and so on to think through the ins and outs of our emerging, framework. Maybe to close this kind of conversation and to bring it back to our movement, the network nations movement we want to create. What are lessons that other people in our community can draw maybe from SeeDAO in order to better understand how we actually trying to construct the network nations going forward?
Yeah, I think SeeDAO's, one of the most kind of interesting takeaways for me personally, and also I'm writing a paper about this, is kind of, non-governance as a form of governance, which I kind of mentioned earlier, where, I think a lot of times we try to optimize for governance structures. But I think in SeeDAO, if we take a closer look at how exactly their kind of, this governance mechanism works, there's very interesting features which are allowing for these kind of, room for uncertainty and room for kind of, possibilities. So I think that's something that, a lot of other groups can potentially learn. And but I think, there's also a lot of, just the examples of communities that we have discussed, like each one has, their own, unique kind of contributions to this. So I hope that in the future we see, kind of more research, just, interpreting and encapsulating all the interesting things that's going on. Because I do think that this is a kind of, pretty niche area that we're all working with. And so I think sharing that knowledge and having, just people becoming more aware of what others are doing, that could potentially lead to a lot of interesting cross-pollinations of ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think your research is like a prime example of the interesting questions that can be surfaced here and addressed. And that's maybe also an open invitation to all of our listeners, all the researchers amongst you to join us in this endeavor to really conceptualize, but also study the empirical examples of some proto-network nations and try to understand like what are core principles, tools, and frameworks that can be synthesized and taken away from these experiments and shared at a larger scale with other community builders to collectively move forward this network nation movement we're trying to build. Thank you so much for your time, Helena. It was super insightful and a great example, I think, of what a proto network nation could look like. Maybe to close this off, where can people find your work, especially your recent work on SeeDAO, and where can they follow your work?
So we just submitted this article to a special issue in a journal, but we also released a preprint. And so if you search for the name of the article, which I'm I'm kind of, it's something I think is interesting. It's called The DAO of the DAO, Eastern Philosophies in Decentralized Worlds. So if you search for that in SSRN, you should be able to find it. And welcome any feedback, comments. Feel free to, shoot me an email if you find some of the ideas interesting or have any feedback on it.
Cool. Thanks. Definitely check it out. And thanks again so much for your time. And to our listeners, hear you next time.
Thank you.